The sound I remember most from that day isn't the judge's gavel. It isn't my lawyer whispering in my ear. It's my husband laughing, out loud, inside a courtroom that was supposed to decide the end of our marriage. I never imagined my life would narrow down to a wooden bench, stiff papers in my hands, and a man I once loved smirking at me like I was a joke he'd already figured out. But there I was, sitting across from Daniel, the man I had shared 13 years with, watching him lean back in his chair as if this divorce hearing were nothing more than a formality. His suit was expensive. His posture was relaxed. His confidence bordered on careless. And when my attorney quietly slid the financial disclosure packet onto the table, Daniel looked at me and laughed. Not a nervous laugh. Not an awkward one. A laugh filled with certainty. Because in his mind, he had already won. You see, for years, Daniel believed one thing with absolute conviction. I had nothing without him. And to be fair, I had helped him believe that. When we met, Daniel was magnetic. The kind of man who filled rooms without trying. He worked in finance, spoke in confident sentences, and carried himself like someone who always knew what came next. I was quieter, more observant. I listened more than I spoke. He used to say that was what he loved about me. "You keep me grounded," he'd tell people. "She doesn't care about money or status." And I didn't. At least not in the way he did. In the early years, we built what looked like a perfect life from the outside. A beautiful house, 2 cars in the driveway, vacations that looked impressive in photos, dinner parties where Daniel held court and I refilled glasses. Whenever someone asked what I did, Daniel would answer before I could. "He manages things," he'd say with a grin. "I take care of the big stuff. He handles the rest." Everyone laughed, including me. What they didn't know, and what Daniel never bothered to ask, was what I was managing. The truth is, I had always believed in preparation. My father taught me that. He wasn't flashy, but he was careful, methodical. He used to say, "Independence is quiet. It doesn't announce itself." When he passed away, he left me more than memories. He left me lessons and opportunities. But I learned early on not to talk about them. Daniel liked to feel needed, essential, important. So when I received my first inheritance distribution, I didn't announce it. I didn't hide it either. I simply placed it where it could grow quietly, untouched by noise or ego. Daniel never noticed. And over the years, that pattern repeated. By the time our marriage began to crack, the cracks weren't loud. They were subtle. Conversations shortened. Decisions made without discussion. Smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes. Daniel began to treat me like a background detail in my own life. He would dismiss my opinions, interrupt my sentences, explain things to me that I already understood. "You don't need to worry about that," he'd say. "I'll handle it." And I let him. Because I had learned that silence kept the peace. Until one evening, silence stopped working. It was over dinner, another quiet meal where the television did most of the talking. Daniel was scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. "I've been thinking," I said carefully. That got his attention. He sighed, like someone bracing for inconvenience. "About what?" he asked. "About us." The pause that followed was heavy. Not surprised, just annoyed. "What about us?" he said. I chose my words slowly. "I don't think we're partners anymore." He laughed then too. A small one. Dismissive. "You're overthinking again." "No," I said. "I'm finally thinking clearly." That was the moment something shifted. His face hardened. His voice cooled. "If you're bored, find a hobby," he said. "Don't turn this into drama." That night, I slept in the guest room. 2 weeks later, I filed for divorce. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't plead. He didn't ask why. He smiled. "You'll regret this," he told me calmly. "You don't realize how good you have it." And then he did something that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. He laughed, which brings us back to the courtroom. Daniel's lawyer, a sharp man with a polished smile, leaned over and whispered something to him. Daniel nodded, still smirking. My attorney squeezed my arm gently. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded, because I was. I had waited years for this moment, not the divorce, but the truth. Still, I won't lie. When Daniel laughed, something inside me flickered. Not fear, recognition. This was the same laugh he used whenever he believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. And he believed it now more than ever. The judge entered. Everyone stood. The room settled into that strange silence that only courtrooms can hold. Thick, formal, and unforgiving. The judge adjusted her glasses and glanced at the case file. "Let's begin," she said. Daniel straightened, confident, relaxed, certain. Because in his version of the story, this was simple. He earned the money, he owned the assets. I was just there. And soon the court would see that too. At least, that's what he thought. The judge began reviewing the preliminary filings. She spoke calmly, methodically, reading names, dates, and figures aloud. Daniel tapped his pen against the table. Then she reached the financial disclosures. And everything slowed. I could feel it before it happened. The shift in the air. The pause that lasted a second too long. The judge frowned slightly. She adjusted her glasses again and looked up. At first glance, she said slowly, there appears to be a discrepancy. Daniel's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" his lawyer asked. The judge turned a page. "I see Mr. Walker's listed assets," she continued, "but I'm also seeing a separate portfolio here, in Mr. Walker's name alone." Daniel leaned forward. "That can't be right," he said, still half smiling. The judge didn't look at him. She looked at the numbers. And then she spoke the sentence that would change everything. The judge held the silence longer than necessary. That's how I knew something was wrong for Daniel. She wasn't confused, she wasn't mistaken, she was verifying. "There is an investment portfolio," she continued, her voice even, "registered solely under Mr. Walker's name, not jointly held, not disclosed in the respondent's initial assumptions." Daniel let out a short breath that sounded almost like another laugh, but it died halfway through. "That's impossible," he said. "Everything I have is accounted for." The judge finally looked up at him. "I'm not referring to what you have," she said calmly. "I'm referring to what he has." The room shifted. My attorney straightened. Daniel's lawyer froze mid-note. And Daniel, who had spent years believing he knew every corner of my life, looked at me for the first time that day with something other than amusement. Confusion. "I don't understand," Daniel said. "What portfolio?" The judge flipped another page. "Several accounts, actually," she replied. "Established over a decade ago. Diversified holdings. Conservative growth early on, followed by strategic expansion." She paused. "Well managed." My attorney smiled faintly. Daniel turned fully toward me now. "What is she talking about?" he demanded. I met his eyes and said nothing, because for once I didn't need to explain myself. The judge continued reading. "Total valuation," she said. "As of last quarter, just over 8 figures." Daniel's chair scraped loudly against the floor as he stood up halfway before his lawyer pulled him back down. "That's not possible," Daniel snapped. "He doesn't work." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Employment," she said evenly, "is not the sole measure of income." The words hung in the air like a verdict all on their own. Daniel stared at me now, not laughing, not smiling, searching. I remember thinking, so this is what it feels like to be seen. Not admired. Not underestimated. Just acknowledged. For years, I had been invisible by design, quiet by choice. I let Daniel believe I was dependent because it made life simpler. It kept his ego calm and our home peaceful. But peace built on erasure always collapses. The judge leaned back slightly. "Mr. Walker," she said to me, "can you confirm that these assets were acquired independently of the marriage?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied. My voice was steady. "They predate the marriage and were maintained separately." Daniel shook his head. No, that's not true. I would have known." The judge didn't even glance at him this time. "Knowledge," she said, "and entitlement are not the same thing." My attorney cleared her throat. "We have full documentation," she added, "including inheritance records, account statements, and tax filings." Daniel's lawyer whispered urgently to him. Daniel brushed him off. "You lied to me," Daniel said, his voice sharp now. I finally spoke. "No," I said. "You just never asked." That landed harder than any accusation could have, because it was true. Daniel never cared what I was building, as long as I stayed in the background of his life. The judge called for a brief recess. As everyone stood, Daniel grabbed my arm, not violently, but desperately. "What did you do?" he hissed. I gently removed his hand. "I prepared," I said. "The same way I always have." For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel had nothing to say. Outside the courtroom, the air felt different, lighter. My attorney leaned close. "He's rattled," she said quietly. "This changes everything." I nodded, but what I didn't say was this. It had already changed me. Because wealth isn't just money. It's leverage. It's safety. It's the freedom to stop pretending. When we returned, Daniel looked smaller somehow. His confidence had cracked and something frantic was seeping through, and the judge resumed. "Given this new information," she said, "we will need to reassess assumptions regarding spousal support, asset division, and financial dependency." Daniel's lawyer stood. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "we request additional time to review these disclosures." The judge nodded. "Granted." She looked directly at Daniel. "I suggest," she added, "that both parties come prepared next time with a clearer understanding of each other's realities." Her gaze lingered on him, and then the gavel struck. As people began filing out, Daniel didn't move. He just sat there, staring at the table where he'd laughed only an hour earlier. I paused beside him. "You always thought I was behind you," I said quietly. He looked up, eyes hollow. "I wasn't," I continued. "I was just walking my own path." I left the courtroom without looking back. And for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't known I was missing. Control. Daniel didn't speak to me for 3 days after that hearing. No calls, no messages. No late-night emails pretending to be practical questions. Silence. And for the first time in our marriage, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like relief. On the 4th day, his lawyer contacted mine. Daniel wanted answers. Not negotiations, not settlements. Answers. My attorney asked if I was comfortable with a mediated conversation. Not a reconciliation, just clarity, closure. I agreed, not for him, for myself. We met in a neutral conference room, glass walls, neutral colors, uncomfortable chairs. Daniel arrived early. I arrived on time. He stood when I walked in, then sat back down as if he'd forgotten why he stood in the first place. He looked tired. Not physically, Daniel always maintained appearances, but mentally. Like a man whose mental map of the world had been erased overnight. "You planned this," he said finally, without greeting. "No," I replied calmly. "I planned for myself." He exhaled sharply. "For how long?" I thought about it. "A long time," I said. "Longer than you think." Daniel leaned forward, hands clasped. "You lived in my house," he said. "You used my accounts. You let me believe, I let you assume," I corrected. He flinched. "You never corrected me. You never listened." That shut him up. Here's the thing about men like Daniel. They don't fear dishonesty. They fear irrelevance. And that's what was creeping into his voice now. How much? He asked quietly. I didn't answer immediately. Enough, I said. Enough that I never needed you for security. Enough that I stayed because I chose to. His jaw tightened. Then why stay at all? He asked. I looked at him, not angrily, not bitterly. Honestly? Because I loved you once, I said. And because you never made me feel unsafe until you did. He frowned. Unsafe? I never. You didn't raise your voice, I said. You didn't threaten me, but you erased me, piece by piece. I paused. And that's its own kind of danger. Daniel leaned back, rubbing his face. I thought we were happy, he muttered. I was peaceful, I replied. There's a difference. That landed harder than I expected. Then came the question he'd been circling since the courtroom. Why hide it? He asked. Why not tell me? I smiled faintly. I didn't hide, I said. I compartmentalized. Same thing. No, I said. Hiding is fear. Compartmentalizing is boundaries. He looked away. You wouldn't have respected it, I added quietly. Oh, he didn't argue, because deep down, he knew it was true. Daniel believed love meant access. Total access. Emotional, financial, personal. But access without respect is just entitlement. After that meeting, something strange happened. Daniel started unraveling his own memories, old conversations, dismissed comments, moments where I'd hinted at independence and he'd brushed them aside. He realized too late that I had shown him who I was. He just never thought it mattered. 2 weeks later, his lawyer reached out again. This time, Daniel wanted to settle. Quickly, fairly, quietly. During the next court appearance, the dynamic had shifted completely. Daniel no longer leaned back confidently. He no longer smiled. He listened. The judge reviewed updated proposals, adjusted expectations, and made one thing clear. There would be no spousal support. Not from him, not to him. We were equals. And equals walk away clean. As we exited the courthouse that day, Daniel stopped beside me. I underestimated you, he said. I nodded. I know. That was my mistake, he added. I met his eyes. No, I said. It was your habit. I walked away. I underestimated how fast the truth would travel. Not because people talked, though they did, but because silence invites imagination. And imagination, when fed half a story, becomes rumor. Daniel had always been the narrator of our marriage. Among friends, colleagues, even family, he was the voice people trusted. Confident, articulate, certain. So when word got out that I wasn't walking away empty-handed, when whispers started circling about how much I actually had, the story didn't spread cleanly. It fractured. At first, people didn't call me. They called him. And Daniel, for once, didn't have the answers. I started noticing it in small ways. A mutual friend canceled dinner, then rescheduled with just me. A colleague of Daniel's sent me a polite message asking to catch up. Even his sister, who had always been distant, called to say she wanted to understand what happened. Understand. That word always appears when certainty collapses. Daniel, meanwhile, was unraveling quietly. Not dramatically, not loudly, but noticeably. He started showing up to meetings late. He stopped posting online. He withdrew from the spaces where he used to dominate conversations. Because dominance only works when no one questions the premise. And now people were questioning everything. One evening, I ran into an old friend of ours at a cafe. I had no idea, she said after a pause. No idea about what? I asked. She hesitated. That you were, well, that independent. I smiled. Neither did Daniel. She laughed awkwardly, then stopped. He always talked like he was carrying the whole thing. I know, I said. She studied me for a moment. You never corrected him. I didn't need to, I replied. He corrected himself. That was the pattern I started to see. People weren't shocked by my net worth. They were shocked by how wrong Daniel had been. And that kind of realization makes people reevaluate more than just one story. Daniel tried to regain control. Not of me, he knew that was gone, but of the narrative. He told people he was blindsided, that I had been secretive, that the marriage failed because of distance and miscommunication. He avoided the one word that mattered: assumption. But the problem with narratives built on ego is this: they collapse under scrutiny. And scrutiny was everywhere now. At our next mediation session, Daniel was different. Not hostile, not dismissive. Careful. You're being very cooperative, I noted. He nodded. I don't want this to get ugly. I almost laughed. It already was, I said. Just not in the way you thought. He looked down. Then came the question I didn't expect. Did you ever need me? He asked. It wasn't accusatory. It was small. I considered it. Yes, I said finally. Just not for the reasons you wanted. He waited. I needed companionship, I continued. Trust. Respect. Presence. He swallowed. I gave you structure, he said weakly. You gave me space, I replied. And then you filled it with yourself. That ended the conversation. As weeks passed, the legal process moved forward smoothly. Too smoothly. Daniel agreed to terms quickly. He didn't contest assets. He didn't push for control, because the real loss had already happened. He had lost the role he valued most: the provider, the authority, the indispensable one. The irony is this: I never wanted to take that from him. I just wanted him to see me standing beside him. But you can't stand beside someone who insists on standing over you. The final paperwork was scheduled. One last appearance. One last signature. One last moment in the same room. Daniel arrived early again. This time, he didn't laugh. He didn't smirk. He looked resigned. As we signed the documents, he paused. You know, he said quietly, if you had told me, things might have been different. I didn't look up. No, I said. They would have been delayed. He nodded slowly. That was his version of acceptance. Outside the building, the sun was bright, almost unfairly so. Daniel extended his hand. I hesitated, then shook it. Take care, he said. I always do, I replied. There's a strange moment after something ends that people don't talk about. Not grief, not relief, stillness. That's what followed the final signature. No phone buzzing, no lawyer updates, no calendar reminders marked divorce call. Just space. And for the first time in years, the space belonged to me. Daniel felt the aftermath immediately. Not financially, he was still comfortable, still well employed, still respected on paper. But socially, emotionally, that's where the real losses lived. The dinners stopped coming. The invitations thinned out. The quiet respect he once enjoyed turned into polite distance. Because people had learned something unsettling. Daniel wasn't as all-knowing as he presented himself to be. And once that illusion cracked, it never fully healed. I heard about it indirectly, of course. A former colleague mentioned Daniel had been passed over for a leadership role. A mutual friend noted he'd become hard to read. Someone else said he seemed angry, but without direction. Anger without a target has a way of turning inward. Meanwhile, my life expanded. Not loudly, not dramatically, deliberately. I moved into a smaller place closer to the city. Nothing extravagant. Clean lines, natural light, quiet mornings. For the first time, every object in my home was chosen without negotiation. Every decision was mine. That alone felt like wealth. I started attending events I used to avoid. Not for networking, but for curiosity. People asked what I did. And for the first time, I answered without minimizing. I manage long-term investments, I'd say calmly. No apology, no deflection, just truth. The reactions were fascinating. Some nodded, unfazed. Some leaned in, suddenly interested. Some recalibrated their assumptions on the spot. That last group was my favorite, because you could see the shift happen. One afternoon, I ran into Daniel unexpectedly. A bookstore, of all places. He looked thinner, less polished. "Hey," he said cautiously. "Hi," I replied. We stood there, surrounded by shelves of stories neither of us had read. "How are you?" he asked. I considered lying out of habit, then stopped myself. "I'm good," I said. "Actually good." He nodded. I figured. There was no bitterness in his voice this time. Just recognition. "I didn't lose you because of the money," he said quietly. I waited. "I lost you because I never learned how to stand next to someone instead of in front of them." I looked at him, surprised. "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," I replied. He smiled sadly. "I guess divorce is expensive in more ways than one." We parted without ceremony. No closure speech. No lingering resentment. Just two people who finally understood what went wrong, too late to fix it, but early enough not to repeat it. That night, I sat alone on my balcony, city lights stretching out in every direction. I thought about how long I'd been shrinking myself to fit someone else's comfort, and how heavy that shrinkage had been. Letting go didn't feel like loss anymore. It felt like alignment. Some endings don't arrive with noise. They arrive quietly, in moments when no one is watching, when the applause is gone and all that's left is truth. That's where Daniel found himself. After the divorce finalized, Daniel did what he always did when things went wrong. He worked harder, longer hours, more meetings, more control. But work has a way of exposing what it can't fix. And for Daniel, work stopped filling the silence. He started noticing things he'd never had to before. How often people interrupted him now. How rarely they deferred. How quickly conversations moved on without his input. Not because he'd become irrelevant, but because authority without certainty doesn't carry the same weight. And Daniel was no longer certain of who he was without being needed. One night, he sat alone in the house we once shared. The house was quieter than he remembered. Too quiet. Rooms echoed differently when no one was trying to impress anyone else. He walked past the office where he used to take calls while I made dinner. Past the dining table where he spoke and I listened. Past the hallway mirror. And that's where it happened. He stopped, looked, and for the first time didn't like what he saw. It wasn't age, or stress, or loss. It was something deeper. A man who had built his identity on comparison and suddenly had no one left to stand above. Daniel did something unexpected after that. He called a therapist. Not to talk about the divorce, not about me, but about control. About why respect felt the same as dominance to him. About why independence in others felt like rejection. About why my silence had felt comfortable until it became dangerous. Growth doesn't always look noble. Sometimes it looks like discomfort you can't escape. Meanwhile, my life had settled into a rhythm that felt honest. No performances. No careful phrasing. No strategic shrinking. I invested time the way I invested money, with intention. I mentored younger professionals, supported causes quietly, built connections without needing validation, and the more I lived openly, the lighter everything became. One afternoon, I received a message from Daniel, just one line. "I finally understand why you never needed to prove anything." I read it twice. Then replied, "Understanding doesn't come with a deadline. I'm glad you found it." That was it. No reopening, no nostalgia, just acknowledgement. Daniel began rebuilding, not upward but inward. Smaller apartment, simpler routines, fewer assumptions. People noticed the change. Some respected it, some didn't care. And for the first time, Daniel learned something invaluable. You don't get to decide how redemption is received. You only decide whether you earn it. As for me, the future no longer felt like something to manage. It felt like something to experience. I no longer introduce myself in relation to anyone else. No husband, no shadow, no footnote, just my name. There's a misconception about endings. People expect fireworks, vindication, a final moment where someone realizes they were wrong and begs forgiveness. Real endings rarely do that. Real endings arrive quietly, when life no longer feels like something you have to explain. A year passed. Not dramatically, not symbolically, just steadily. The divorce stopped being something people associated with my name. Daniel stopped being a reference point. The story lost its sharp edges and softened into context. And that was the true victory. I no longer measured my days by productivity or restraint. I traveled, but not to impress anyone. I worked, but only on projects that aligned with how I wanted to live. I spent time alone without feeling lonely. There's a difference between solitude and isolation. I had finally learned it. Occasionally, someone would still ask, "What really happened? How did he not know? Didn't it feel good to surprise him?" I always gave the same answer. "It wasn't a surprise," I said. "It was a reveal." Because I never became someone new. I simply stopped hiding. The memory of the courtroom still visited me sometimes. Not Daniel's laughter, but the moment it stopped. That pause, that shift, that instant when the truth entered the room and everything rearranged itself around it. I didn't replay it for satisfaction. I replayed it as a reminder. Never again. I ran into Daniel one last time at a mutual friends gathering. We spoke briefly, cordially, like two people who had finished a chapter and didn't feel the need to reread it. He looked steadier, not powerful, not dominant, human. Before leaving, he said something that surprised me. "You were never the quiet one," he said. "I just made too much noise." I nodded, and that was that. As I drove home that night, I realized something important. I had spent years thinking my wealth was the secret. It wasn't. The secret was my restraint, the discipline to build without announcing, the strength to wait without shrinking, the confidence to let someone underestimate me without correcting them. Because when the truth finally arrived, it didn't need decoration. It spoke for itself. If there's a lesson in all of this, it isn't about money. Money just made the truth impossible to ignore. The real lesson is this: never confuse silence with absence. Never confuse calm with weakness. And never laugh at someone who isn't trying to impress you. They may already be standing on ground you haven't even seen yet. I don't tell this story to shame Daniel. I tell it because somewhere, someone is being underestimated right now. And they're wondering if staying quiet means staying small. It doesn't. Sometimes silence is just preparation. And sometimes, the reveal speaks louder than anything you could ever say.